In the Gundam card game, not all cards are created equal. In this video, I'll be breaking down the cards that you should keep an eye out for that may or may not actually push you away from having success in this card game. Just a quick reminder before we get into things though, I do have a community Discord. Links to those will be down in the description if you want to talk anything and everything about the Gundam card game. Assuming you come from other card games, there are certain styles of cards that tend to lean themselves into feeling better than they are. Things like early aggro or ramp pieces end up not being as impactful because of the way that the game actually plays out. Perfect example of this is Zaku 1. This card is a 1-drop 1/2 vanilla stat line. And while not amazing in other games, you can see early bodies having a lot of usability in aggro decks. However, unfortunately, the existence of EX bases, which is a base that you start the game with, makes it so that early aggro pieces really aren't as strong unless they can threaten the cracking of that base. Because of that, how does your turn progression end up? Well, realistically, you end up playing this on turn 1 because it is one of 3 plays that you can make as the turn 1 player on your first turn. But now you have a 1/2 on board that will take 3 attacks to crack into a shield. So now you're like, that's fine. He just needs to be there as an early body that I can do something else with in the future. Okay, well then on turn 2, you're going to play a bigger body. Turn 3, maybe you're able to crack a shield, then you maybe get 1 damage in. So what you've effectively done is lose a card in hand to establish a 1/2 body that'll eventually, at some point, at the discretion of your opponent, deal 1 damage to one of their units. Not super impactful and not exactly where we want to be. This is in stark contrast to Zaku 2, which very similar stat lines, however, when attacking gains 3 AP. This is a huge difference, whereas Zaku 1 can actively really put you behind. Zaku 2 can actually put you so far ahead that just being able to play him early and get a lot of pressure that way will actually put you significantly further ahead. In that same vein, that's why I feel the same way about Ball. Ball has the same issues, except now it's a 1/1, which means a lot of removal spells also get rid of it. Gun Tank gets rid of it, so on and so forth, with the added benefit that Ball gets to heal, which ends up not really mattering because by the time you need the heal that Ball provides, you'll probably end up losing the card. If you're playing against green, you have like the freest breach target in the world. So the card just ends up sticking on board and existing to not fulfill the needs that it needs to. And at that point, you're probably better off using a command card that heals as opposed to relying on Ball, which like, hey, it can deal damage and also heal. But realistically, all you're really doing is putting behind your tempo in a way that is really hard to recover. And that's the biggest thing with these level 1 units. They end up not applying the board presence necessary to be able to sway the game one way or another. And with the existence of green and breach being one of the best things that you can do in the beta edition, it is really tough to put a body that doesn't have significant stats or significant tempo to then just sit there and potentially be a free breach target. On the topic of breach though, a lot of people will be interested in playing First Contact. And I have to say, as someone who's fell into the trappings of this card before, First Contact is really, really hard to play in this format. 2 big reasons for that. 1, tempo loss. The game is extremely board centric, and having a turn where you're effectively doing nothing while your opponent is deploying more and more bodies is really hard to come back to, which is normal for ramp strategies. They tend to take a few turns off to then be able to play big bombs. The problem being that the best things you are playing if you ramp in this game is Gundam Wing. And while Gundam Wing is a very powerful card, especially if you get him off with Hero, to be able to start restabilizing the board, it is not enough of an impactful play to be able to take turn 3/4 off, which are some of the most impactful turns in the game. So by accelerating yourself resources wise, you're not actually maintaining a board that allows you to be able to close out the game once you're actually deploying your bombs, unless you just got like the luckiest draws in the world and going back to back wing hero, wing hero, wing hero. And the biggest part of that is that there's no boss monster to really make value of the fact that you're taking a turn off. If eventually we get boss monsters that are massive removal, or can deal multiple points of damage, or in some way, shape, or form can swing back the tempo that you've lost back to your end, then at that point, I think there's huge value in doing things like First Contact, or alternatively, Wing Gundam Bird Mode, which gets a pass because it's a unit and it can link with Hero, so it's got a few things going for it. If you're looking to get into the late game, the best thing I can say is just utilize board control pieces that'll help you get there. If you're in blue, you're better off utilizing board control pieces that rest mode so that you can attack into units early and progress your way into having level 6 so you can start playing Wing Gundams. I think that is a much more reliable route to be able to play the biggest thing we can play in the game, at least so far. Shifting gears over to white, and we're going to look at a pilot. Guel is a incredibly mid pilot. If you're going to be playing the Academy strategy, I think there's reason to be able to play him just off the back that he has the trait necessary to be able to link pair with a lot of the units the strategy is trying to do. However, this pilot is almost always going to be a vanilla 1/1 pilot, which is not amazing. As an activate main once a return, if your opponent has 8 or more cards in their hand, set this unit as active and it can't attack during the turn, which for the most part, you're not playing a ton of blockers in the Academy strategy. So what you're effectively doing is just preventing your early bodies from being able to be attacked into. It's not phenomenal. And I tell you right now, outside of some very specific matchups in which white is probably already winning the game, this will never come online. And if your opponent does have a big hand size, the game already punishes that by forcing them to discard down to 10 if they have above that at the end of the turn. Essentially, there are just so many things not going towards Guel being fantastic that really the only value it provides, and it's why it's not a completely useless card, is the fact that it does have the Academy trait, which links with things like Garibaldi and a bunch of different other units like that. So it does have that benefit going for it, but I don't love the card. Moving on over to a fan favorite, and we actually have Gundam Unicorn. And this is more 2 cards. Gundam Unicorn, in terms of an archetype as a whole, can probably and will probably see some sizable play depending on the support pieces it gets from set 1. However, when it comes to the beta, it is just so non-flexible with everything else that the beta provides that it's really hard to justify. And in this case, I think the card's there more as a showcase of what is to come than what is really meant to be played with. During pair, when it's destroyed, if this is a link unit, which currently we only have 1 Banisher links to be able to link with this, return its paired pilot to its owner's hand, then discard 1 card. So you get the pilot back, but you lose a card, though Banage draws a card if it's a link pair on pairing. So the cards clearly work together. Banage does +2/+2 in stats, so he's definitely one of the strongest vanilla pilots available. But the problem is the way that it works in terms of his typings, the way that it works in his names, he doesn't link pair with anything else, and then Unicorn can't be paired with anything else. So now you're on level 5 resources, whereas other people are making their most impactful plays on level 4 and on level 6. So you're kind of in that middle range where you're not doing the most impactful things you can be. You're just playing an okay body and maybe cycling through some cards, which doesn't feel phenomenal. I think it'll have value in the future depending on the support pieces it gets. But for what we see now, I think leaning on trying to do any unicorn style decks will be more of a detriment than it will be a benefit. Looking at our only base, the only one that I really feel hits that trap status is side 7. The level 1 cost, which doesn't make sense because you are never going to want to replace your EX base with this base on turn 1. So it kind of doesn't matter depending on how early you can play. Your EX base is usually going to survive at least 2 turns unless you're facing down like Zaku 2 Rush, which can happen. But even then, at that point, you're putting yourself in a very dangerous position with the fact that this base only has 4 health. 4 is a very important stat line in this game. You can consider that as almost the barrier to entry to play this game. Effectively, in terms of the units that get deployed, 4 is where you're able to trade with other units. It's where you're getting some of the best stat lines without being linked or paired. Because of that, it just means that being at that 4 range puts this base at the sweet spot of really not being effective in terms of absorbing hits. Whereas if you have a base with 5 HP, then you get the added benefit that you're probably going to be able to soak up 2 attacks for it to go away. Side 7 does have an ability, which has made me consider playing it, but in terms of the way that these things play out, it hasn't been phenomenal in terms of the trade-off of having a weak base on board. Actimate or rest the space, choose 1 friendly unit, it recovers 1 HP. There are some cute lines where you could do things like giving your Wing Gundam enough HP after an attack to be able to survive a follow-up attack, but now you're doing multiple things in terms of holding this mediocre card for a potential combo play in the future that realistically wasn't all that impactful, especially when you could be playing other bases that are being more proactive about the way that you're playing the game. Just off the fact of being a base that can hit early and do something, I don't think it's as bad as a lot of other cards we've talked about, but I will say that it is not phenomenal. And then finally, I'm going to talk about Gundam Aerial. Now, I stand that Gundam Aerial isn't as bad as everyone says it is, right? It is a body with stats that can link with a pilot that's actually pretty decent. The problem is in terms of what this beta provides. The biggest problem with Aerial is that she exists in a world where the deck that is needed for her doesn't really exist thus far. Level 5, 3 cost unit. While there are 4 or more command cards in your trash, this card in your hand gets a cost of -2. Which means you can play it out for 1. The thing is that by the time you're at level 5 in this game, you're in a position where being able to play 3 for a unit is not a big deal. Being able to pay 3 plus the piloting cost for Soletta is not a big deal. So it's not so much that the card doesn't do neat things, especially since with Soletta and refreshing resources, you're effectively only paying 1 for a link paired unit, which is really cool. It's the fact that the stat lines don't line up really well. 4 AP is that sweet spot for units that aren't paired. So the fact that when you're pairing, you're only putting yourself at a position to be able to deal 4 damage, assuming with Soletta Mercury, now you're in a position where you can't break bases. And sometimes you're trading up, but you're trading up on a position of 2 for 1ing yourself as opposed to doing a 1 for 2 if you're using a non-paired unit. Then to overcome that, like, okay, but now we can just play the academy base to be able to buff up our units. But now we're doing a mixture of not only having the academy base online, but having enough commands in our drop to make the payoff make sense, to then be able to play a 4-4, which may or may not be a 5-4. And now you're starting to see that all these things have to come together for a payoff that is very mediocre, when in that same line, I can just a turn previously play Wu Fang into a Gundam and then start breaching my opponent. So it's not so much that the card doesn't have any pros to it. It is the fact that it is an opportunity cost versus being able to do anything else at that level, at that point in the game, that will have more impact. I stand that Aerial may have a place in the game in the future, especially since the kind of thing that she's trying to promote is playing this very combo heavy, low to the ground kind of strategy. And I think the biggest thing right now is that the pieces just aren't there. Your biggest piece of support are the other academy cards to try to play like an academy rush deck. And then you got pilots like Guel, which don't really add to the strategy as a whole, which ends up making the whole thing kind of mediocre when you piece it together. That said, I don't think it should prevent you from playing academy stuff. If you love Witch of Mercury, by all means, play it. It is a strategy that can come together. It's just sometimes you might find yourself kind of feeling behind in terms of the card quality that other people are playing. That said, that's just my opinion. You guys should let me know what cards you guys think are mediocre or better than what I thought. I'll catch you guys on the next one.